The biting Wyoming wind of 1888 whispered a tale of endings. For Alice Mason, a widow with hands as cracked as the barren earth she farmed, the end looked like starvation. For her 2 children, Caleb and Lily, it looked like an orphanage. But one stormy afternoon, fate dragged a different kind of ending to her doorstep, a man bleeding out in the mud, with secrets stitched into his fine but tattered clothes. She had a choice: risk what little she had for a dying stranger, or close the door on a man already marked by death. What she didn't know was that this single act of mercy would ignite a fire of love danger and a stunning act of devotion that would change their world forever. The dust was a living thing on the Mason homestead. It settled on every surface, a fine, gritty shroud that tasted of poverty and forgotten dreams. It coated the patched quilt on the bed where Alice Mason's husband Thomas had drawn his last fevered breath 2 years prior. It clung to the threadbare clothes of her children, 10-year-old Caleb and 6-year-old Lily. For Alice, the dust was a constant reminder of her failure. Her life had been scraped down to the bone. Mornings were a battle against the sun, tending a stubborn patch of corn and beans that seemed to resent the very soil they grew in. Afternoons were spent mending clothes that were more patch than fabric. Evenings were the worst. In the flickering lamplight, the silence of the small 2-room cabin would press in, amplifying the hollowness in her chest where Thomas's laughter used to be. Caleb, with his father's serious eyes, had tried to fill the void. He was small for his age, but he chopped wood with a fierce determination, his face set in a grim mask of responsibility that no 10-year-old should wear. He rarely smiled anymore. He saw the dwindling sacks of flour the worry etched into his mother's face, and the burden settled on his narrow shoulders like a yoke. Lily was the last spark of light in their dim world. She would hum to the chickens create families out of corn husks, and find beauty in the single stubborn wildflower that grew by the porch steps. But even Lily's light was beginning to flicker. There were nights her stomach rumbled, and Alice had to distract her with stories, her own hunger, a dull ache she had long grown accustomed to. This particular Tuesday in late October felt different. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind sweeping down from the Bighorn Mountains carried a chill that promised an early and brutal winter. Alice stood on her porch, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the clouds gather. They had enough firewood for a month, maybe. The last of the salted pork was gone. They were living on cornmeal mush and hope, and they were running out of both. Mamma Caleb said, coming to stand beside her. He held the worn handle of his father's axe. That sky looks mean. We should bring the chickens in close. Alice forced a smile, reaching out to brush a stray piece of straw from his hair. You're right, Cal. Always thinking ahead, just like your pa. The mention of his father made Caleb's jaw tighten. He just nodded and headed for the rickety coop. It was as they were securing the last of their meager livestock that the first drops of rain fell, cold and heavy, splattering against the parched earth. The storm broke with a fury that seemed personal. Rain lashed against the cabin's lone window, and thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very floorboards. Lily, who was usually fearless, crawled into Alice's lap, her small body trembling. Alice held her close, humming a soft lullaby as she stared into the meager fire, praying the roof would hold. An hour passed, then 2. The storm settled into a relentless driving downpour. It was then, during a lull between claps of thunder, that they heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It was a low, agonized groan, almost carried away by the wind. Caleb's head shot up. What was that? Alice stilled her hand, resting on Lily's back. Probably just the wind in the eaves, sweet boy. But then it came again, closer this time. A human sound, a sound of pure misery. "It's coming from the creek bed," Caleb whispered, his eyes wide. Every instinct screamed at Alice to stay inside, to bar the door and protect her children from whatever trouble was drowning out in the storm. This was a hard land for honest folk. For those caught in a storm, it was often because they were running from something or someone. But the memory of Thomas's helplessness, the feeling of being powerless, as life slipped away, stirred within her. "Stay here, both of you," she commanded, her voice firm. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me." "Understand?" Caleb nodded, his face pale. Lily clung to her skirt. "Don't go, Mama. I'll be right back, little bird." She pulled on Thomas's old oilskin coat, the scent of him still clinging faintly to the fabric, and grabbed the lantern. Stepping out into the maelstrom was like walking into a wall of water. The wind tore at her, and the rain instantly soaked her hair. She shielded the lantern's flame with her body, its flickering light a tiny beacon in the tumultuous dark. She followed the sound, slipping and sliding in the slick mud. The creek, normally, a gentle trickle, was now a churning, muddy torrent. And there, half submerged in the rushing water, snagged against a fallen cottonwood, was the body of a man. He was face down, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle. His clothes, though caked in mud, were of a fine cut. A leather vest over a linen shirt. Nothing like the rough denim and flannel of the local ranchers. A costly-looking hat lay half buried in the mud nearby. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He was likely dead. She should turn back. But as she got closer, she saw the slight rise and fall of his back. He was alive. Barely. With strength born of desperation and a deep-seated humanity she couldn't ignore, Alice waded into the cold, swirling water. She grabbed the man's shoulders and heaved. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to pull her down with him. "Help me," she gasped, though no one could hear her over the storm. She gritted her teeth and pulled again, her muscles screaming in protest. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him out of the creek and onto the muddy bank. She rolled him over. His face was a mess of blood and mud, a deep gash on his forehead, oozing crimson. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by a rattling cough that sent a fresh wave of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. But it was the dark, spreading stain on his side that made her breath catch. He'd been shot. For a terrifying moment, she stared at him, the rain washing streaks of mud from a face that was all sharp angles and strong lines, even in unconsciousness. This was trouble. The kind of trouble that could swallow her and her children whole. But as she looked at his still form, she didn't see a threat. She saw a life hanging by a thread, just as Thomas's had. And she had been powerless then. Mama, maybe she wouldn't be now. Mama making a decision that would forever alter the course of their lives. Alice Mason hoisted the dying stranger, half carrying, half dragging him through the mud and the storm, back toward the fragile warmth of her home. The cabin door creaked open, revealing Caleb standing with the fireplace poker clutched in his small hands, his knuckles white. His eyes widened at the sight of the bleeding, mud-caked man Alice was struggling to support. "Mama, who is he?" "No time for questions, Cal. Help me get him to the floor by the fire." Together they managed to haul the man inside and lay him on the rag rug before the hearth. Lily peeked out from behind a chair, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fascination. The stranger was a stark and violent contrast to their quiet, ordered world of hardship. He smelled of rain, mud, and blood. "Get me the water basin and the clean rags from the chest." Alice ordered her voice, taking on a clinical calm she didn't feel. She was a farmer's wife, not a doctor. She'd set her own share of broken bones in chickens and stitched up gashes on her husband, But this was different. This was a bullet wound. As Caleb scrambled to obey, Alice carefully began to cut away the man's shirt. The fabric was fine linen, impossibly soft, even when soaked and bloody. The wound in his side was ugly, a dark, puckered hole, oozing blood sluggishly. It was low, and she prayed it hadn't torn through anything vital. There was another wound, too, a nasty exit wound on his back, larger and more ragged. The bullet had gone clean through. A small mercy, perhaps. "Hold the lantern closer, Cal," she murmured. Caleb did his face a grim study in the flickering light. He watched his mother work with a desperate intensity. She cleaned the wounds as best she could with boiled water and strong lye soap, her touch surprisingly gentle. The man didn't stir save for a low moan that rumbled deep in his chest. "He's burning up," she said, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. The fever was already taking hold. For the next 3 days, the stranger's life hung in the balance, and his shadow fell over every corner of the Mason cabin. Alice forced broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips. She constantly changed the dressings on his wound, which began to weep, a sickly yellow fluid that terrified her. She sat by his side through the nights, dozing in a chair, waking at every pained murmur or shift. His presence consumed their meager resources. The clean rags were now stained and boiled daily. The firewood dwindled faster to keep the cabin warm and the water boiling. The small bit of jerky she'd been saving was stewed into broth for him. Caleb watched it all with a silent, simmering resentment. This man was a danger, a drain, a ghost at their table eating food they didn't have. "Why are we helping him, Mama?" he asked one evening, as Alice was grinding herbs into a poultice. "We don't have enough for ourselves. What if he's a bank robber or a murderer?" Alice didn't look up from her work. "What if he's a husband or a father? When your pa was sick, I would have given anything for a stranger to show up with a cure. We don't get to choose who needs our help, Cal. We just choose whether to give it." Her words silenced him, but they didn't erase his suspicion. He observed the stranger with an almost predatory focus. He noted the calluses on the man's hands. They were the calluses of a man who worked, who knew his way around a rope and a horse, but there was a softness to them, too. He noted the man's gun belt, which Alice had removed and placed on the high mantel. The pistol was a Colt Peacemaker, but the handle was pearl intricately carved. No simple farmhand carried a gun like that. And in the man's leather vest, Alice had found a small waterproof pouch. Inside was a wad of cash that made her gasp more money than she had seen in her entire life, and a single tarnished silver locket. She didn't open it. She simply wrapped it back up and hid it away. This man was wealthy, and wealthy men had powerful enemies. Lily, on the other hand, was captivated. She would sit on the floor a few feet from the stranger, watching him breathe. One afternoon, while Alice was outside, Lily crept closer. The man was muttering in his fevered delirium, tossing his head back and forth. Words tumbled out fragmented and nonsensical. "Lost the trail. Blackwood. Can't let him. Catherine, I'm sorry." Lily reached out her small hand and with a startling gentleness placed it on his hot forehead. "Shh," she whispered, as she often did to her dolls. "It's okay. Mama will fix it." The man's thrashing stilled. His breathing seemed to even out. He didn't wake, but some measure of peace settled over him. When Alice came back inside, she found her daughter stroking the unconscious man's hair, humming her little tune. Alice's heart clenched. This stranger was no longer just a body she was mending. He was becoming woven into the fabric of their lives, for better or worse. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Alice was wiping his face with a cool cloth when his eyelids fluttered. They opened slowly, revealing eyes the color of faded denim, hazy and confused. He blinked, trying to focus on the ceiling, on the strange woman's face, leaning over him. "Where?" He rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "You're safe," Alice said softly. "You were shot. I found you in the creek." He tried to push himself up a sharp intake of breath, hissing through his teeth as pain lanced through his side. "Easy now," she said, gently pushing him back down. "You've been hovering between this world and the next for days. You need to rest." His gaze swept the room, taking in the sparse furnishings, the patched walls, and the two wide-eyed children watching him from the doorway. He looked back at Alice, a flicker of something, gratitude, confusion, suspicion in his eyes. "Why?" he asked the single word, holding a universe of meaning. Alice wrung out the cloth in the basin. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said simply. He studied her face, the exhaustion under her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the kindness that radiated from her despite it all. He had been left for dead by men he knew and saved by a woman who knew nothing about him. The irony was as sharp as the pain in his side. "My name," he said, his voice still weak but clear, "is Brian." It was a lie. Alice didn't know why she knew it was a lie, but the feeling settled in her gut with the certainty of a winter frost. This man was a storm, and he had just woken up in the middle of her house. The man who called himself Brian was a difficult patient. He was proud and stubbornly independent, chafing at his own weakness. The pain in his side was a constant torment, but he rarely complained. He would watch Alice with those piercing blue eyes as she changed his dressings or brought him food, a silent intensity in his gaze that made her feel both seen and terribly vulnerable. His presence shifted the delicate balance of the small family. Caleb remained wary, his posture stiff whenever Brian was awake. He'd answer questions with curt, one-word replies, his distrust a palpable force field around him. Lily, however, had adopted the stranger as her own personal project. She would bring him the prettiest stones she found by the creek and tell him long, rambling stories about her cornhusk dolls. One afternoon, Brian was finally strong enough to sit up, his back propped against the cabin wall. Lily sat beside him, carefully trying to braid a piece of twine. "My pa used to braid ropes like that," Brian said, his voice stronger now, with a low, pleasant rumble to it. "Only bigger." "My pa is in heaven," Lily said, matter-of-factly. "He got a fever. Ma says he's an angel now watching over us." Brian looked over at Alice, who was kneading dough on the small wooden table. He saw a flicker of pain cross her face before she smoothed it away. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, quietly to Lily. "It's okay," she said, concentrating on her twine. Mama is real strong, and Caleb, he's the man of the house now. He tries to be anyway." Later that day, Brian watched as Caleb struggled to split a stubborn log of pine wood. The boy would swing the heavy axe with all his might, but the wood refused to yield. Grunting with frustration, Caleb threw the axe down. "Let me show you something," Brian called from the doorway, leaning heavily on a staff he'd carved from a fallen branch. He limped over his face, pale with the effort. "You're putting all your strength into it, but you're not letting the tool do the work. It's about where you strike, not how hard." He took the axe, balanced it, and pointed to a small fissure in the wood. "See that crack? The wood wants to split there. Just give it a reason." With a single, seemingly effortless swing, he brought the axe down. The log split cleanly in two. Caleb stared first at the split wood, then at Brian. It was the first time he'd looked at the man with anything other than suspicion. It was a look of grudging respect. "My father taught me that," Brian said, handing the axe back. Said it was true for wood, and it was true for people. Find the crack and the rest is easy. Slowly over the next 2 weeks, the ice began to thaw. Brian, or Mr. Brian, as Lily called him, began to earn his keep. He taught Caleb how to set snares, and they caught 2 rabbits, providing the first fresh meat they'd had in months. He showed Alice how to reinforce the leaky corner of the roof using pine tar and canvas. He had a quiet competence about him, a knowledge of the land and its ways that spoke of a life spent outdoors. But the mystery of his past remained. He never spoke of where he came from or where he was going. He never mentioned the names he'd muttered in his fever. The expensive gun belt remained on the mantel, a silent testament to the life he'd left behind. The turning point came on a crisp, clear evening. The air was cold, and the fire cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Brian was staring into the flames, a familiar, haunted look on his face. "You never told me who shot you." "Brian," Alice said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. He turned to look at her. The firelight carved deep shadows under his cheekbones. "It's better you don't know. These are not your troubles. When I dragged you out of that creek, your troubles became mine." She countered her gaze unwavering. "We're running out of flour. The first snow will be here any day. I need to know if we're waiting for it to melt or for more men with guns to show up on our doorstep." He let out a long, slow breath. He looked at Caleb dozing by the fire, and Lily asleep in her small cot. He looked at Alice, whose face showed not fear, but a weary strength that he'd come to admire more than anything he'd ever known. "My name is not Brian," he said, his voice low. "It's Justin. Justin Stone." The name meant nothing to Alice, but to anyone involved in the cattle business from Texas to Montana, it was like naming royalty. The Stone family, led by his formidable father, Augustus Stone, ran one of the largest and most powerful cattle operations in the country, the Stone Cross Ranch. "I had a disagreement with my father." Justin continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "About how he does business. About a man named Silas Blackwood. Blackwood is my father's right hand, but he's a snake. He's been buying up small ranches, squeezing them out with threats and violence, all under the Stone Cross banner. I found proof of his rustling and land fraud." He paused, rubbing his healing side. "I was bringing that proof to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. Blackwood and his men must have gotten wind of it. They ambushed me north of here. They took my horse, my papers, and left me for dead. They thought the storm and the coyotes would do the rest." Alice felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This wasn't a simple robbery. This was an assassination attempt tied to a powerful cattle empire. The name he'd muttered in his fever, Blackwood, now made terrifying sense. "This Silas Blackwood, does he think you're dead?" she asked. "He's a thorough man. He won't be satisfied until he sees a body. He'll have men looking, quietly at first, asking questions in towns, checking with sheriffs. Once he gets word that a stranger was found near here, he'll come." The silence in the room was suddenly heavy, filled with unspoken fears. Caleb was now wide awake, listening to every word. The stranger wasn't just a stranger anymore. He had a name, a history, and an enemy. An enemy who was now, by extension, their enemy. Justin reached into his pocket and pulled out the wad of cash Alice had found and returned to him. He tried to press it into her hand. "This is for you, for everything. You should take the children and go. Head west to Oregon, maybe. This will be enough to start over somewhere safe." Alice looked at the money, then back at his face. She pushed his hand away gently. "This is my home, Justin," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "Thomas and I built it with our own hands. My children were born here. I buried my husband on that hill. I'm not running." She took a deep breath. "You said Blackwood's men will be asking questions. Then we'll need a story. As far as anyone needs to know, you're my cousin Brian Mason, come from Missouri to help me with the farm through the winter. And you got that wound when a skittish mule kicked you." Justin stared at her, stunned. She was not just refusing to run, she was offering him shelter, a name, a place in her family, knowing full well the danger it invited. Caleb, who had been listening intently, walked over. He looked not at his mother, but at Justin. "My pa never ran from a fight," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Masons don't run." In that moment, Justin Stone, the wealthy heir who had tried to fight his battles with proof and laws, understood something profound. Courage wasn't about the size of your ranch or the power of your name. It was about standing your ground on a small patch of dirt with nothing but your family beside you and declaring, "This is mine, and I'm not running." He was no longer a stranger in their home. He was an ally, and the storm that was coming was no longer his alone. Life on the homestead settled into a new, fragile rhythm. Brian Mason became a part of the landscape. He and Caleb worked side by side, their earlier animosity replaced by a quiet, burgeoning camaraderie. Justin, as Alice still thought of him in the privacy of her own mind, taught the boy how to track, how to read the sky for weather, and how to properly sight and fire the small hunting rifle Thomas had left behind. With each lesson, he was filling a void in Caleb's life that went far beyond chores. He was giving the boy a father figure, and in doing so, rediscovering a part of himself he thought he'd lost. His bond with Lily was simpler, built on shared secrets and laughter. He would carve her small animals from scraps of wood and listen patiently as she explained the complex social dynamics of her cornhusk family. His presence had brought a lightness back into the cabin, a sense of security Alice hadn't realized was missing until it returned. Her own relationship with Justin was a delicate, unspoken dance. They worked together with an easy familiarity, their hands brushing as they passed tools, their gazes meeting over the dinner table. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, they would sit by the fire, talking in low voices. He told her about his life back in Texas, a world of sprawling ranches, lavish parties, and a suffocating loneliness. She told him about Thomas, about their dreams of building a life, and the crushing weight of watching that dream die. They were two people from different universes, finding common ground in their shared experiences of loss and resilience. A tender affection was growing between them, as quiet and persistent as the wildflower by the porch, but the peace was a thin veneer over a simmering threat. Every rider on the distant horizon, every unfamiliar wagon heading toward the nearest town of Redemption Creek, sent a jolt of anxiety through Alice. The first sign of trouble came not as a rider with a gun, but as a man in a suit. His name was Mr. Abernathy, a banker from Redemption Creek. He arrived one morning in a polished buggy, his face pinched and sour. He didn't even have the decency to get down. "Mrs. Mason," he called out, his voice thin and reedy. "A word, if you please." Alice wiped her hands on her apron and met him by the fence, with Justin standing a few paces behind her, leaning on a fence post, looking for all the world like a simple farmhand. "Mr. Abernathy?" she said coolly. "The bank holds the note on this property. As you know," he began without preamble. "Your late husband took out a sizable loan for seed and equipment 2 years ago. Payments have been sporadic at best. The bank's patience has worn thin. We need the outstanding balance of $200 by the 1st of December, or we will be forced to foreclose." Alice's blood ran cold. $200. She might as well have tried to scrape 200 stars from the sky. It was a death sentence for her homestead. I can't possibly. Those are the terms." Abernathy sniffed already, flicking his reins. "Good day." As the buggy turned, another man rode up alongside it, a man whose presence made the air feel heavy and cold. He was large, with a cruel slash of a mouth and a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. This was Sheriff Brody, a man known to be more interested in lining his own pockets than upholding the law. Brody's eyes, small and dark, like a boar's, swept over the homestead, lingering on Alice for an uncomfortably long moment before settling on Justin. "Who's this?" Brody grunted, nodding at Justin. "My cousin Brian," Alice said quickly, her voice tight. "He's here from Missouri to help for the winter." Brody sized Justin up, his gaze lingering on Justin's healing but still stiff posture. "Heard tell a fella got himself shot up in these parts a month or so back. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Brian." Justin met the sheriff's gaze without flinching. "Can't say I have, Sheriff. Only excitement I've had was a run-in with a mule. Nasty temper on that animal." He even managed a slight, convincing limp as he shifted his weight. Brody grunted again, unconvinced. "Folks are saying a man by the name of Silas Blackwood has been buying up land in this county. Paying good money, too. Might be worth your while to consider his offer before the bank takes this place for pennies." He smirked, then spurred his horse and trotted off after the banker's buggy. The threat was clear. It wasn't just the bank. Blackwood was behind this, using the law and debt as a weapon. He was tightening the noose. That night, the mood in the cabin was somber. Justin placed the roll of cash on the table. It was more than enough to pay the bank. "Here," he said. "Pay them. It's the least I can do." Alice shook her head, her pride a stubborn, unbending thing. "No, that's your money. And even if we pay it, Blackwood won't stop. He doesn't just want the land. He's looking for you. He put the squeeze on us to see who came out to help. Sheriff Brody wasn't asking questions. He was delivering a message." A new chilling thought occurred to her. Why this land? It's barely fertile. The creek is shallow most of the year. Why would a man like Blackwood want this place so badly? Justin's face hardened as a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "The map," he said, more to himself than to her. "The one I had with the papers. It showed the survey lines for the new railroad spur. My father was fighting to get it routed through his territory. Blackwood must have known about an alternate route." He looked at Alice, his eyes grim. "The survey must run through here. This creek, it's not about the water for crops. It's about water for a steam engine. Your worthless land is sitting on a gold mine, Alice, and Blackwood means to have it." The news hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They weren't just fighting a greedy land grabber anymore. They were in the way of the railroad, in the way of progress and power, and men who would kill to secure it. The pressure escalated. A few days later, their fence was cut and the chickens scattered. Caleb found their milk cow dead by the creek, a bullet hole in her side, a brutal message disguised as a stray shot. Fear, cold and sharp, began to permeate their lives. Caleb started carrying the rifle with him everywhere. Alice found herself sleeping with the old fireplace poker by her bed. Justin was consumed by a quiet, burning rage. These people had saved his life. They had shown him more decency and kindness than he had known in years. And now, because of him, their lives were in jeopardy. His battle had come to their front door, and he would not let them face it alone. "He's trying to scare you off, Alice," Justin said one evening, his voice a low growl. "He wants you to run to sell for nothing. He doesn't want to make a scene that might attract the wrong kind of attention before he's secured the land title." "I told you," she said, her voice steely. "I'm not running." "I know," he said, his blue eyes locking with hers. "So we fight." He wasn't just talking about fighting Blackwood. He was talking about fighting the bank, the corrupt sheriff, the entire system that was bearing down on them. He was no longer Justin Stone, the runaway heir. He was Brian Mason, a man defending his family. And the gathering storm was about to break. The 1st of December arrived with a biting wind that promised snow. The deadline. Alice knew that Mr. Abernathy would send Sheriff Brody to serve the foreclosure notice. Her hands trembled as she dressed the children that morning. This could be their last day in their home. "What are we going to do, Mama?" Caleb asked, his face pale and tense. Before Alice could answer, Justin spoke. "We're going into town," he said, his voice calm and steady. "All of us." Town. Alice was aghast. "They'll be waiting for us. Brody." "That's the point," Justin said, strapping on the pearl-handled Colt, which he'd meticulously cleaned and oiled the night before. It looked both alien and perfectly natural on his hip. "Blackwood and his puppets are bullies. They thrive in the shadows on isolated homesteads where no one can see them. We're not going to let them do this in the dark. We're going to make our stand in the light." He had a plan. It was risky, reckless even, but it was better than waiting passively for the axe to fall. Trusting him, Alice bundled up. Lily grabbed her best shawl, and they all climbed into the old buckboard wagon. The ride to Redemption Creek was silent and tense, the rhythmic clop of the old horse's hooves sounding like a countdown to doom. Redemption Creek wasn't much of a town, a single dusty street lined with a general store, a saloon, a bank, a smithy, and the sheriff's office. As they pulled up in front of the bank, heads turned. The Masons rarely came to town all at once. Just as Justin predicted, Sheriff Brody emerged from his office, followed by 2 brutish-looking men Alice had never seen before. They weren't locals. They had the hard, merciless look of hired guns. They moved to block their path to the bank. Well, look what we have here." Brody sneered, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Come to hand over the keys, widow." "We've come to speak with Mr. Abernathy," Alice said, her voice shaking but defiant. She clutched Lily's hand tightly. "The time for talking is over," Brody said, stepping forward. "This property now belongs to the bank, which has already accepted a generous offer from a private investor. You're trespassing." He gestured to his deputies. "Escort them out of town. Mama, make sure they collect their things and are off that land by sundown." One of the hired guns reached for Alice's arm. In a flash, Justin moved. He didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he stepped between the man and Alice, his body a solid, immovable wall. "Get your hand off her," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a deadly authority that made the larger man pause. "And who are you to be giving orders?" the man snarled. "Cousin Brian." "That's right," Justin said, "and I'm here today not as a farmer but as a concerned citizen." He raised his voice, pitching it so that the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered shopkeepers' ranchers in for supplies, a blacksmith wiping his hands on an apron, could hear clearly. "Sheriff Brody here is about to evict a widow and her 2 small children from their home on behalf of the bank," Justin announced. "A home they built with their own hands. He's doing this just before the first snow, knowing full well it could be a death sentence for them." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. These were hard people, but they had a code. Evicting a widow in winter was a line many were not willing to see crossed. Brody's face purpled with rage. "This is official bank business. It's the law." "Is it?" Justin counted his eyes, scanning the crowd. Or is it the business of Silas Blackwood, the man who's been choking the life out of this county, the man who this sheriff works for? He pointed a finger at Brody. I wonder what the territorial marshal would think about a sheriff using hired guns to enforce a foreclosure for a private investor who stands to profit from a new railroad spur. A spur whose route is supposed to be confidential information. The mention of the railroad and the marshal sent another shock wave through the onlookers. This was bigger than a simple foreclosure. That's slander! Brody roared, his hand now gripping his pistol. You're under arrest. On what charge? Justin asked coolly. Defending a woman or telling the truth? The two hired guns started to advance, but now the crowd was stirring. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Elias, stepped forward, a heavy hammer still in his hand. A few other ranchers shifted their positions, their hands drifting near their own sidearms. They didn't know Justin, but they knew Brody, and they despised him. Seeing his advantage, Justin pressed it. He walked directly to the bank's door where Mr. Abernathy was hovering, looking terrified. Mr. Abernathy, Justin said loudly, Mrs. Mason is prepared to offer you $250 in cash right now to settle her debt and clear the title. That's $50 more than the outstanding balance. Abernathy stammered, his eyes darting to Brody. The bank has already accepted another offer. An offer you haven't closed on yet, Justin cut in. Under the law, you are obligated to accept payment of the debt from the original owner at any time before the final sale. Are you a man of finance going to break the law in front of all these fine people, Mr. Abernathy? For a man like Blackwood. Checkmate. Abernathy was a weasel, not a fighter. Trapped between a furious sheriff and a suddenly hostile public, he wilted. No, of course not. The bank will accept the payment. Justin turned to face Brody, whose face was a mask of pure fury. The hired guns looked uncertain, their authority evaporating without the backing of the law. It seems your work here is done. Sheriff, Justin said, his voice dripping with ice. Brody held Justin's gaze for a long, hate-filled moment. He knew he was beaten for now. He had been outmaneuvered and humiliated. This ain't over, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. Blackwood will hear about this. About you. He turned and stalked back to his office, his thugs trailing behind him like beaten dogs. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, some even clapping Justin on the back. He paid them no mind. He turned to Alice, who was staring at him, her eyes shining with tears and something more gratitude and a deep, burgeoning love. She had watched him transform from a wounded stranger into a brilliant and courageous defender. He hadn't used his fists or his gun, not really. He had used the truth as a weapon and the community as a shield. Inside the bank, Justin paid the debt with his own money, and a visibly shaken Abernathy stamped the deed as paid in full. When they emerged back into the sunlight, holding the paper that secured their home, Caleb looked at Justin with pure, unadulterated hero worship. Lily ran and hugged Justin's legs tightly. As they climbed back into the wagon, Alice placed her hand over Justin's. What you did? She started, her voice choked with emotion. I did what anyone would do for their family, he said simply, his gaze meeting hers. The word hung in the air between them. Family. They had won the battle, but as they rode out of Redemption Creek, Justin knew Brody's threat was a promise. They hadn't defeated Silas Blackwood, they had just made him angry, and a man like that, when angered, would stop using proxies and start handling things himself. The real fight was yet to come. The victory in town was a brief reprieve, a single deep breath before the plunge. Peace did not return to the homestead. Instead, a tense, vigilant quiet took its place. Justin knew Silas Blackwood had been publicly humiliated, and a man like that would not let such an insult stand. Retaliation would be swift and merciless. Together, he and Caleb fortified the small cabin, barring the windows and reinforcing the door. In the crucible of shared work and imminent danger, Justin taught the boy how to handle a rifle, his voice calm and steady, as he prepared a 10-year-old for a war he prayed would never come. The shared threat stripped away all pretense between Justin and Alice. The quiet affection that had grown between them finally blossomed into something undeniable one evening by the firelight. As they cleaned the weapons, their hands brushed a simple touch that felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent cabin. Just as Alice whispered, her voice tight with fear, "What's going to happen to us?" He stopped his work and met her gaze, his expression softening. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you or the children." He swore, his voice thick with an emotion that went beyond gratitude. "You and this family. You reminded me what it feels like to have something worth fighting for." He reached out his calloused fingers, gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. He leaned in and kissed her, a desperate, heartfelt promise made in the shadow of impending violence. The reckoning came 3 nights later, under the cold, watchful eye of a full moon. Justin heard it first, the muffled tread of horses approaching through the woods. "They're here," he said, grimly. "Alice, get the children to the cellar. Now." She didn't argue. She hustled a sleepy Lily and a terrified but determined Caleb toward the hidden trap door. "Stay down there no matter what," she commanded Caleb. "Your job is to protect your sister." As the cellar door closed, 5 riders emerged from the tree line, led by the menacing silhouette of Silas Blackwood. Stone Blackwood's voice boomed across the clearing. "You've made your last mistake. Give yourself up and I'll let the woman and her brats live. You're not a man who leaves witnesses." "Blackwood," Justin yelled back, taking position at the window. "Have it your way," Blackwood snarled. "Burn it." A man with a lit torch charged the cabin. The night exploded. Justin fired and the man fell clutching his shoulder. In the same instant, a second shot rang out from the darkness near the woodpile, and another of Blackwood's riders toppled from his horse. Confused, Blackwood and his remaining men fired blindly into the shadows. Suddenly, a powerful voice cut through the chaos, deep and commanding. "Silas Blackwood, you are trespassing and firing on my son. Drop your weapons." From the trees rode a dozen horsemen, all armed with rifles. At their head was a formidable figure that made Justin's blood run cold, his father, Augustus Stone. "Did you really think I wouldn't come looking for my own blood, boy?" Augustus bellowed, his presence dominating the field. We heard whispers in Redemption Creek of a new farmhand who outsmarted our crooked sheriff. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together. Trapped and exposed, Blackwood's face twisted in a snarl of fury. "Your son is a traitor, Augustus. He was taking lies to the marshals. I found the ledgers your men failed to take from his saddlebags." Silas Augustus replied, his voice like cracking granite. "The real ledgers, the ones showing the ranchers you've murdered. Your game is over." Knowing he was doomed, Blackwood made a final desperate move, firing wildly at the cabin. "If I'm going down, I'm taking him with me." Justin pushed Alice to the floor as the Stone Cross men answered with a deafening, decisive volley. The fight was over in seconds. When the smoke cleared, Blackwood and his men lay still in the moonlight. The silence that followed was profound. Justin opened the cabin door. He and his father stared at each other across the yard, the space between them filled with years of anger and pride. "You always did have a knack for finding trouble." Boy Augustus said, his gruff voice betraying a hint of relief. "Seems to run in the family," Justin replied. He turned and pulled Alice into a fierce embrace as the adrenaline faded, leaving them both trembling. The battle was over. Augustus Stone and his men were grimly efficient, erasing the night's violence, and making it known that the Mason homestead was under Stone Cross protection. Augustus stayed for 2 days, a towering presence of quiet observation. He and Justin walked and talked for hours, slowly mending the fractured bridge between them. Before leaving, Augustus found Alice by the well. "Mamamum," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My son was lost. You found him. There's no debt I can pay that would cover that." He glanced toward the cabin where Justin was showing Caleb a new horse, a gift he'd left behind. "I came here to bring him home, but I see he already is." With a tip of his hat, the great cattle baron rode away, leaving his son to the new life he had chosen. The question of the future lingered. Justin was free to return to his world of wealth and power, and the thought terrified Alice. She had fallen in love with Brian Mason, the steadfast man who belonged here. A week later, Justin found her on the porch at sunset. "I sent a telegraph to my father's lawyers," he said, his voice quiet. Alice's heart sank. This was it. "They've purchased the 2,000 acres surrounding this homestead," he continued, taking her hands in his. "It's all in your name now, Alice. No one will ever threaten your home again. I've also instructed them to fund the construction of a proper school in Redemption Creek, so Lily and Caleb can have the education they deserve." Tears welled in Alice's eyes. He wasn't leaving. He was building. He was putting down roots. "But there's a third thing," he said, his voice growing thick with emotion. He pulled out the small, tarnished silver locket she had found on him that first day. He opened it, revealing a faded portrait of a sad-eyed woman on one side and an empty space on the other. "This was my mother's," he said softly. "She always said, a man's real wealth is the family that calls him home. I've been carrying this for 10 years, waiting to find the person who belonged on this other side." He looked deep into Alice's eyes, his own shining with unwavering love. "Alice Mason, you and your children are the finest, bravest people I have ever known. You saved my life, and then you taught me how to live again. I don't want to be Justin Stone, cattle baron. I want to be Brian Mason, your husband. I want to be a father to Caleb and Lily." He took a shaky breath. "Will you marry me?" The tears streamed freely down her cheeks. Unable to speak, she threw her arms around his neck and held him tight. He had been saved by a poor widow, and in return he gave them the one thing his money could never buy, a family. And for all of them, under the first stars of the vast Wyoming sky, it was a new dawn. And so, the story of Alice Mason and Justin Stone comes to a close. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in gold mines or on sprawling ranches, but in the quiet courage of a stranger's kindness. Their journey from a desperate widow and a dying cowboy to a loving, powerful family shows us that true strength isn't about the absence of fear, but about standing for what's right, even when you're terrified. He didn't just save her farm, he honored her strength, he cherished her children, and he built a new legacy, not of wealth, but of love. If this story of courage, love, and unexpected blessings touched your heart, please let us know by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who loves a story about the enduring power of the human spirit. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you won't miss our next journey into the heart of the past. Thank you for listening.